We need to be faster, not safer. The words echoed through the glass-walled conference room like a slow punch to the chest. My name is Cal Bennett, 48 years old, senior safety architect at Trident Energy Systems in Houston, Texas. For nearly a decade, I'd been the quiet force behind the safety protocols protecting our offshore operations. Complex rigs, volatile environments, and hundreds of lives at stake. Now, with a new COO, Victor Lang, 2 weeks into his role, everything was shifting. "Your safety protocols are slowing down deployment," he said, flipping through my incident risk assessments like they were outdated memos. "We're losing our edge. Other companies are building twice as fast." I kept my tone calm, even as my gut twisted. Those same companies have experienced rig explosions, worker fatalities. We haven't. Victor gave a thin smile. "It's not about stopping accidents, Cal. It's about bouncing back when they happen." Around the table, department heads nodded, eager to please. No one contradicted him, except me. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "We've avoided disasters because we don't take shortcuts. Offshore isn't like land-based ops. One mistake out there is permanent." But Victor wasn't interested in nuance, not in history, not in what we'd built. If you've ever worked in silence to keep people safe, only to watch speed get praised over safety, hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes, the quietest voices hold the loudest truths. 2 days later, I tried to access the offshore incident monitoring logs, something I reviewed daily, and was greeted by a denial notice. "Access restricted," it read. At first, I assumed it was a system glitch. But when I called the IT desk, the technician responded with a quiet hesitation. "This was a directive from the COO's office, Mr. Bennett. All safety logs are being consolidated into the general analytics platform." My chest tightened. That system wasn't built for real-time hazard tracking. I'd flagged its limitations a dozen times in executive reviews. No layered access control, no incident pattern recognition, no timestamp integrity. It was a dashboard for optics, not for lives. I stared at my screen in silence, then opened my private drive. Over the years, I'd documented my methods, procedures, and emergency protocols. Nothing confidential, no company data, just frameworks I'd created. I copied everything onto an encrypted flash drive. A quiet insurance policy. Something inside me shifted. I wasn't angry yet, just alert. There's a moment when you sense a slow-motion collapse before it begins. This was that moment. The following morning, my personal safety alert tool flagged 3 anomalous access attempts on our offshore pressure valve data. Entries that bypassed standard user logs. I blinked, double-checked, and reran the scan. It wasn't a false positive. Someone had tried to poke holes in a system only I knew inside out. No one else noticed. Not IT, not the operations team, not even Victor, who had just addressed the staff about streamlining digital noise. I leaned back in my chair, the office buzz fading into a low hum. I remembered when I first joined Trident, back when it was a scrappy, high-risk, high-integrity company with rusted rigs and relentless purpose. I'd left a federal safety consultancy role to join them, walking away from a steady pension and a reserved parking space. My father thought I was insane. "You're giving up security for a gamble," it said. But I saw something in Trident's mission, something worth protecting. For 9 years, I did just that. I built silent systems behind the scenes, risk mitigating layers no one asked for. But that worked. We'd had 0 catastrophic failures, not because of luck, because of discipline. Now, someone was testing the foundation, and no one even knew the ground had started to shift. At lunch, I sat across from Julia Tran, our senior rig planner, in the courtyard behind Building B. Her tray of half-eaten salad sat untouched as she leaned in. "They're pushing sprint cycles beyond threshold," she said quietly. "We're skipping cross-checks on equipment orders. QA's drowning." I nodded. "What about regulatory compliance?" She gave a helpless shrug. "Victor says we're reinterpreting intent. His words, not mine." I stirred my coffee, eyes fixed on the far fence. That wasn't reinterpretation. That was evasion. Later that afternoon, Noah, one of my engineers, stopped by my desk. "Cal, weird question. Facilities asked about our emergency pressure release protocols. Apparently, Victor wants to know why we can't bypass the delay timers." My pulse quickened. "Did you explain why?" "Yeah, but he kept pushing. Asked if there were undocumented overrides for edge cases. There weren't. Not officially." After Noah left, I sat still for a long while. This wasn't just about efficiency anymore. It was erosion. Subtle. Systematic. I had built those timers after a minor blowout 6 years ago. They existed for a reason. And now they were being chipped away by people who didn't even know why they were there. Thursday morning, a calendar invite appeared in my inbox. Safety Infrastructure Restructure. Cal Bennett and Victor Lang. 2 p.m., room 4C. I stared at it for a few seconds, then spent the morning combing through every layer of my monitoring dashboards. Everything was stable. The redundant pressure systems were responsive. Hazard thresholds were within normal limits. The predictive diagnostics tool I'd built over weekends still ran clean, flagging nothing abnormal. At 1:59, I walked into room 4C. Victor was already there, stone-faced, and beside him sat Karen from HR, her tablet closed but hands folded tightly. "Cal," Victor said, "thanks for coming. Let me get straight to it. We're restructuring the way safety operations are managed across Trident." I didn't sit. "We're decentralizing oversight. Each rig unit will handle its own protocols going forward. Your role as central safety architect is being eliminated." Karen slid a manila envelope across the table. "We've put together a severance package." Victor continued. 3 months' pay, benefits extension, plus accelerated equity vesting. I opened the envelope. It was generous, more than expected, which meant the decision came from higher up. "And the systems I built? We'll migrate to third-party solutions, more scalable, less dependent on legacy structures." Legacy. That's what they called 9 years of custom safeguards, 9 years of trust. I wrote down every credential on a yellow notepad: control systems, hazard response console, lockdown triggers. Victor reached for it. I paused, looking him in the eye. Just make sure whoever replaces me knows what they're walking into. Then I handed it over. And I walked out. Not angry, just certain they had no idea what they were dismantling. 2 days later, I was sitting on the shore of Clear Lake, watching oil tankers move slowly across the water, when my phone lit up with a string of texts. "Noah. Cal, systems are behaving weirdly. Unusual pressure fluctuations flagged. Can you call?" I stared at the messages, unmoving. Part of me wanted to ignore them, to let Victor learn the hard way what happens when you dismantle safeguards you don't understand. But instinct doesn't shut off that easily. I called. Noah answered on the first ring, his voice tight. "Something's wrong. The backup gauges are jumping and no one knows why. The diagnostics panel's lighting up, but the main system isn't registering it as critical." "What's Victor saying?" I asked. "He's in meetings. Ops says it's probably just a sensor delay, but..." It doesn't feel like that. I closed my eyes. Did anyone check the shadow diagnostic system? Noah went silent. The what? The tool I built during the 2020 pipeline leak. It runs a parallel check and flags silent failures. It's not listed in the main documentation. Where do I find it? I walked him through it slowly. 3 minutes passed. Then he whispered, "It's lit up. All red." "Shut down external flow immediately," I said. "I don't have that level of access," he replied. Of course he didn't. In their rush to remove me, they forgot to hand over the keys. 3 hours later, my phone rang. Caller ID, Trident HQ. I let it buzz twice before answering. "Cal, it's Victor." His voice was strained, edges fraying. "We're seeing unusual behavior in the main pipeline relay. Diagnostics are unclear. Can we consult with you?" I paused. "You want my insight on the system you removed me from?" "No one said your work wasn't valuable," he replied quickly. "We're just rethinking how it's managed." I kept my tone even. "How's that working out?" Silence stretched between us. "We're willing to pay your consulting rate?" Victor said finally. "My rate is $850 an hour, 4-hour minimum, paid up front," I replied. "And I won't assume liability for outcomes. I also can't directly interact with your systems. I've accepted another position." That last part was a bluff. I hadn't signed anything yet. But Victor didn't know that. "Cal, this is serious." "Yes," I said quietly. "It is." And I ended the call. They'd made their choice, and now they were living the consequences. Not because the system failed, but because no one left understood how to hold it together. The next morning, I checked the industry news out of habit. Nothing at first. But by noon, headlines began to appear on sector blogs and safety boards. Trident Energy investigates safety incident on Gulf rig. Pipeline fluctuations spark concern over recent infrastructure changes. My phone had 6 missed calls. 3 from Noah, 2 from unknown numbers, and 1 from Julia. I listened to the voicemails in order. Noah's voice cracked. "It's bad, Cal. The system's unstable. They can't isolate the pressure source. We're flying blind." The unknown number. Victor. "Cal, we need your help. Please call me. The board's involved now." And finally Julia, her voice low but urgent. "They've lost control of the secondary line. Ops can't lock it down. Everyone's pointing fingers. But I know this wouldn't have happened if you were still here." I sat at my kitchen table, coffee untouched. It had taken less than 72 hours. Not for the system to break, but for ignorance to catch up to it. They didn't fail because the safeguards weren't there. They failed because they dismantled what they didn't understand. That afternoon, I finally returned Victor's call. This time, he answered on the first ring. "Cal," he breathed, "we're in trouble. We think the pressure equalization failsafe isn't activating. The safety valves aren't locking down lateral flow between segments." My stomach dropped. "Did the auto-isolation trigger?" A beat of silence. "What's that?" "There's a hidden protocol in the segment control layer. If it detects inconsistent flow or unauthorized routing, it isolates each pipeline segment automatically." "I've never heard of that." "Of course not," I said. "It was part of an emergency upgrade during the 2021 rig fire near Bayou. I submitted it for formal documentation twice, but it was deemed non-essential admin overhead." Victor muttered something I couldn't catch. Then, more muffled voices. He came back on, sounding tense. "There's no mention of it in any of the infrastructure diagrams." "It wouldn't be," I replied. "It was approved under emergency conditions and never fully documented." Can you tell us how to trigger it manually? If it hasn't auto-engaged, something's been disabled. Check the scheduled tasks for a verification cycle labeled Deep Segment Check. It runs every 6 hours. A pause. Then, it's there. But it's been disabled. I closed my eyes. Who disabled it? Victor exhaled. It was part of the restructuring to reduce system overhead. Of course it was. Piece by piece, they'd torn it apart. While Trident scrambled, I received a message on LinkedIn from someone I deeply respected. Elena Morris, CTO of Aegis Corps, one of the nation's top safety tech consultancies. Heard you might be available. Would love to talk. We met later that day at a quiet cafe near the marina. Elena didn't waste time. Word's out about Trident. But more importantly, word's out about you. 9 years, 0 critical incidents. That doesn't go unnoticed. I nodded, saying little. We're expanding our offshore safety division. We need someone who's been in the trenches, who's built systems that actually work under pressure. I've seen your rig contingency protocols. You think long-term. That's rare. The offer was direct. Leadership position, full autonomy, generous compensation, and a dedicated team. No chasing approval, no cutting corners. I told her about my non-compete clause with Trident. Our legal team reviewed their standard severance, she said with a small smile. You're clear. They didn't consider us a competitor, just a vendor. Funny how short-sighted leadership can be. For the first time in days, my shoulders eased. This wasn't just an exit. It was a beginning, one that valued everything they tried to discard. That evening, just as I was reviewing the offer letter from Aegis Corps, my phone buzzed again. Trident's main number, I answered. Cal, it's Julia. Have you seen the news? I hadn't. I opened my laptop and scanned the headlines. Trident Energy confirms critical offshore safety failure. Multiple rigs impacted. Client confidence plummeting. Stock drops 27% amid crisis. How bad is it? I asked. Her voice cracked. Worse than we thought. At least 5 rigs affected. 42 personnel temporarily evacuated. They're calling in external safety auditors, but no one can make sense of your old systems. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all settling in. I'd built those systems to endure, built them under pressure through corners they refused to fund. They were complex because the stakes demanded it. Now, dismantled by speed-driven ignorance, they had no roadmap. No way back without starting over. I'm sorry, I said softly. Julia didn't hesitate. You warned them. This isn't on you, Cal. But I still felt the hollow ache of watching something you built to protect fall apart in the wrong hands. The next morning, I signed Aegis Corps' offer. By noon, I was at their downtown Houston office, badge in hand, being introduced to my new team. 8 engineers, smart, curious, eager. Elena had already assigned my first task, draft a post-incident recovery framework tailored for offshore environments. That afternoon, as I settled into my new desk, my phone buzzed with one last message. Stephen Clark, Trident's CEO. The board would like to discuss bringing you back. Name your terms. I stared at the text, unmoved. There was a time I would have said yes. A time I believed that fixing things from the inside was still possible. Not anymore. They hadn't just removed me. They had erased the knowledge without understanding its purpose. And now, they were living the cost of that decision. I didn't respond. Instead, I emailed Elena the first draft of the recovery framework. Subject line: Avoiding the next Trident. It was time to build something better, without compromise, without shortcuts, and without having to justify why safety matters. A month into my new role at Aegis Corps, Bloomberg released an investigative report. The collapse of Trident, when speed overrode safety. I read it at my desk, coffee in hand. The article laid everything bare. How internal emails revealed Victor had overridden system protocols despite documented objections from operations. How requests to formally document and preserve legacy safety systems had been denied as non-essential admin overhead. How restructuring decisions were made with no grasp of their long-term consequences. There it was in black and white. Everything I had tried to protect, dismantled by short-sighted ambition. That same day, 3 of Trident's top clients announced they were terminating contracts. Their press releases cited a loss of confidence in operational integrity. On LinkedIn, I watched the wave unfold. Former colleagues updating job statuses. Middle managers listing open to work. Even Victor, his headline now read, Strategic Consultant. Former COO no company listed. At Aegis Corps, inquiries began flooding in from former Trident clients. During one call, a client safety director asked plainly, "Were you the one who built Trident's original safety framework?" I answered with a quiet certainty. "Yes." He exhaled. "That's why we're calling you first." 6 months later, Aegis Corps' offshore division had tripled in size. Many of our newest clients were former Trident partners seeking systems they could trust. Built by hands that understood failure wasn't an option. Julia now led our field compliance team. Noah had joined as my lead diagnostics engineer. Trident, quietly acquired, their name retired, their tech absorbed. Their fall, now a case study in corporate training slides and MBA courses. When speed kills structure. I ran into Stephen Clark at a safety summit in Vancouver. We ended up side by side at the hotel bar, the evening winding down. "No hard feelings?" he asked, lifting his glass. "None," I replied honestly. "Business decisions come with costs. Sometimes they're heavier than expected." He nodded slowly. "I pushed back, on the changes. Got outvoted." "That's boards for you," I said with a faint smile. "How's Trident's recovery budget looking?" He sighed. "Irony is, we're now paying Aegis Corps 3 times your old salary for emergency consulting." I didn't gloat. I simply said, "Security always gets paid. The only question is, up front or after everything breaks." The following Monday, I stepped into Aegis Corps' Houston office, coffee in hand, ready to start the week. Elena was waiting near my desk. "Veritas Energy just called," she said. "They had a near miss this weekend. Their CISO wants emergency assistance." I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't they just hire Victor Lang?" She nodded. "They did. Same playbook, same pressure. They cut half their safety review cycles last quarter." I let out a slow breath. "Let the junior team take the lead. You need the experience." Elena smiled. "You're sure?" "They'll handle it," I said, turning back to my screen. That afternoon, I finalized our new client onboarding documentation. A living manual, written with care and precision, every line clear, every system mapped. No assumptions, no shortcuts. At the top of the framework, I added a new section title, Understanding the Full Safety Architecture, the Foundation of Trust. My father used to say that job security isn't about where you work. It's about being the one who sees the risks others don't. He was right. In the end, safety isn't just a system, it's a mindset. One you carry with you, wherever you go. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Buffalo Bayou, I found myself alone in Aegis Corps' war room. Lights dim, screens humming softly. I wasn't there to solve a crisis. Not this time. I was reviewing a case file from one of our newer clients, an offshore platform that had narrowly avoided a cascading failure thanks to our recent framework. Reading the post-incident notes, I recognized patterns, not just in the data, but in the decision-making. The same creeping pressure to move faster, the same dismissal of quiet warnings. It was always the same story, just in different colors. But this time, the system held. The isolation protocol triggered as designed. The alert pathways lit up correctly. The team followed the checklist we'd created down to the letter. And no one was hurt. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Not out of relief, but something quieter. Fulfillment. For years, I'd tried to convince people that prevention wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. That safe was not the enemy of speed, but its foundation. Tonight, I didn't need to prove anything. The work had spoken for itself. A few weeks later, I visited one of our clients' offshore rigs in person. A routine audit, but one I volunteered for. It had been years since I'd stood on a deck. Wind slicing in from open water, steel beneath my boots, systems humming around me. The site lead, a sharp young engineer named Luis, walked me through the control room. "We've been following the Aegis Corps protocols to the letter," he said proudly. "Even ran a mock isolation drill last week. The team nailed it." I checked the logs. Everything was clean. No missed handoffs, no unexplained overrides. Just systems running like they should, because people had been trained, trusted, and prepared. As I stood by the observation window, watching the waves churn below, Luis spoke again, more quietly this time. "Honestly, sir, some of the older guys say this feels like the early days of Trident, back when it was still about doing things right." I didn't respond right away, just nodded, feeling a strange ache beneath the pride. Maybe we couldn't undo the past, but we could build better this time. And we were. One rig, one protocol, one decision at a time. Late one night, I stayed behind at the office to review a draft report from our junior team. They'd just wrapped up a rapid response deployment for a mid-sized drilling company, one facing mounting pressure from investors to modernize at all costs. The signs were all there. Rushed rollouts, skipped safety drills, minimal documentation. But this time, they'd reached out before it was too late. The report was solid, structured, clear, every risk flagged, every solution mapped. I made a few notes, then paused at the final paragraph. One of our analysts had written, "We applied the Bennett methodology to segment controls and redundancy layers. Results were stable under simulation and exceeded minimum thresholds." I smiled quietly. Not from pride, exactly, from recognition. That was the difference now. At Aegis Corps, the systems didn't just survive me. They grew beyond me. They were teachable, transferable, understood. For years, I'd carried the weight of being the only one who knew how to hold it all together. Now, I wasn't alone anymore. The legacy wasn't in the code. It was in the clarity. A few days later, I received a package at my home address. No sender listed, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges, heavy with ink. My old engineering log from the early Trident days, the one I thought I'd lost during the office move years ago. Tucked inside was a note. "Figured this belonged with you. I found it in the archives, buried under old server layouts. Thought you might want to see where it all began. Julia." I sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages. Sketches of early rig layouts, flow charts scribbled in the margins, emergency response sequences tested at 2 a.m. And on the final page, a quote I'd written long before I understood what it meant. Real safety isn't built into systems, it's built into decisions. I closed the notebook and stared out the window for a long moment. Not out of nostalgia, but out of clarity. We spend so much time chasing titles, budgets, approvals. But in the end, the real work, the work that matters, is what endures in the hands of others. What lives in the decisions they make when no one is watching. And for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying it alone. The systems were working, the people were learning, and I, finally, was home. Every Thursday morning, I now spend an hour in Aegis Corps' glass-walled training room. No dashboards, no alerts, just a whiteboard and a half circle of eager faces. New hires, interns, engineers who've never set foot on a rig, but want to understand what failure really looks like when safety isn't taken seriously. I don't lecture, I tell stories. About pressure valves that jammed at the worst moment, about protocols that were ignored until they saved lives. About the nights I spent on rigs watching the sea, knowing one wrong move could cost everything. Today, I handed one of them, Gabriel, a sharp kid with a quiet curiosity, an old schematic. "Tell me where the weakness is," I said. He studied it, then pointed to a bypass line nobody else had flagged. I smiled. Good. That would have cost us 12 hours in a live scenario. Around the room, heads nodded. Notebooks filled. This wasn't about reliving the past. It was about giving them something I never had. Context. The why behind every redundant layer. The human reason behind every alert. Later, as I packed up, I found a note left on the whiteboard in neat handwriting. "Thanks for teaching us what the manuals don't." I stood there for a moment, just still. Maybe legacy isn't what you build. Maybe it's what you pass on.